So to look at, say, deforestation out of those examples that you've given, how does deforestation cause an increase in the transmission of both zoonotic and vector-borne diseases?
Right. So let's take it one at a time, I guess. With the vector-borne disease, it's a complex cycle, right? Because now you've got let's keep it simple, like malaria, where you don't have another non-human vertebrate involved. It's human to mosquito to human. Even then, the mosquito habitat is really the crux of the issue. And so when you deforest, you create radically different habitats. And mosquitoes are dependent on water bodies for their breeding. And so if you deforest and you eliminate favorable breeding sites, then you'll probably get a decline in that particular vector-borne disease. On the other hand, if it generates new breeding sites that are much more favorable to vectors, then you may very well see an increase. So it's that kind of immature vector breeding habitat that I think lies at the very heart of the problem. And it just so turns out that the changes that we impose on the environment when we go into new areas tends, on the whole, to be more favorable to vectors. And why is that? It's curious. I guess we're also very good hosts for the pathogens, and so it could be quite evolutionarily advantageous, basically, to have the vector transmit a pathogen and have a wonderful host readily and available right there. So why? It's hard to say exactly, but on the whole, we found that to be the case. As far as zoonoses go, a little bit different there, but overlapping. So with zoonotic diseases, you have to typically bring species into contact that normally don't come into contact, allowing for enough of these jump over events to occur that it can take hold. So it's a stochastic event, and it requires multiple introductions to probably take hold, not a single one usually. But you do this enough as a human, encroaching upon habitat, shall we say, that eventually it will then manifest itself within a local human population and then maybe go from there into the larger population. And so activities that really give rise to that are where you bring together, again, habitats that normally aren't together. So take, again, the example of a farm, cattle ranching farm, shall we say, and forest. Well, in this event, what we found, for example, practically in Panama, is that you have these rodents that traverse both. There are these opportunistic species that like to go from one to the other. So you can easily imagine that if you have such a host that is versatile in both environments and carrying a pathogen at the same time, they can easily introduce something from one, contained location into another.
This isn't a new sort of development. Like, these malaria has been around for a long time. I think I remember reading something like they can estimate that half of the human population to date has been killed by malaria. So why is it that we are seeing now more and more of these sort of incursions of viruses into the human population? Whether it's Ebola, dengue, Zika, these are all things that are really accelerating, it seems, in the last, let's say, 30, 40 years. So why is that?
Right. I think the common thread for a lot of these is intensified human activity in natural habitats with also intensified trade. So these two factors, I think, are critical. And by trade, I mean that in a big way. So includes, for example, travel, cruise ships, all these events. Take Zika once again. If you go way back to their origins of Zika, it came from the Zika forest, we presume, right? Which was indeed a densely forested area of Central Africa and Uganda. And if you look at it now, versus 50, 60 years ago, the deforestation is quite apparent. And it's been replaced. The forest has been replaced by farming predominantly. And so you can imagine that basically might have allowed for kind of an intensified transmission amongst humans, mosquitoes and humans. And then you add to that, the trade. For example, the Chinese have been very active in Africa, undertaking a lot of infrastructure projects, for example. They bring large numbers of people in, and then they go back to China. So there have been yellow fever outbreaks for the first time in China. Well, I shouldn't say outbreak. There have been cases that haven't taken hold in China, but they bring back pathogens, right? And so then we have all the container ships that leave China to the rest of the world. Similarly, we have cruises that hop from one island to the other, to the other, to the other, bringing people and mosquitoes from place to place to place. So you combine these factors, and essentially you're making a rare event much less rare by increasing the frequency at which all these are occurring. That's driving a lot of it.
How much of a correlation is there between land encroachment and the rise of diseases? Like what is the correlation between the two?
Right. So it's a very heterogeneous field. And there are differences for every pathogen involved. So with that caveat, it's hard to put a number on that, but I think there have been attempts, for example, with malaria, to put a number on it. And typically, in a most recent paper that I saw from Mordecai and McDonald, they cite several percentage points increase in malaria for every 10% deforestation that has occurred in the Brazilian Amazon. What we found when we kind of looked big scale at multiple different pathogens, many different vectors, was essentially that there was a significant association globally with deforestation and rise of vector-borne disease, and there was also a rise in the prevalence of mosquito types that are good vectors with increasing deforestation. So yeah, it's not a number that I'm putting on it right now because it's really hard to do. There
is a correlation there between the two.
There's a positive correlation for a lot of diseases, yes. Not all, but a lot.